gentlemen. So, we all love to look sharp, wear trendy clothes, and feel confident. But do we consider the ulterior impacts of our choices? Since 2005, clothing production in the world has doubled. This is due to fast fashion. Fast fashion is the clothing that's sold at most stores at the mall or online, and these stores are coming out with weekly or monthly collections, whereas traditional fashion comes out with 2 seasonal collections. Apart from increasing the amount of clothing ending up in landfills, fast fashion has a multitude of negative impacts. From using excessive amounts of water, up to 5,000 liters for a single pair of jeans, to emitting billions of metric tons of carbon emissions with each collection. That's insane. With the golden age of social media and apps like TikTok and Instagram, the circulation of trends and microtrends has also accelerated exponentially, making the life cycle of fast fashion clothing notoriously short. Despite all of its negative impacts, though, fast fashion has a distinct advantage over traditional fashion. It's considerably cheaper, yet still offers the trendiest apparel. It's cheap because it's made in countries with poor labor compensation laws and working conditions, and made with materials that are unsustainably sourced. However, it's not just the affordable brands that are the miscreants. Luxury fashion brands have also been known to be manufacturing their items in the same sweatshops that they so haughtily criticize. For a sector of the global economy that's worth $1.5 trillion, the fashion industry is very behind in the science backing them. In fact, there is an infamous lack of real studies on the environmental impact of this industry. Fortunately, though, awareness of the dark side of fast fashion is rapidly growing, especially in the younger generation. So, how do we combat fast fashion and move towards more sustainable clothing? As Bright Simmons said in his TED Talk, to help solve global problems, look to developing countries. So here we can learn a thing or two from countries like Pakistan, where most clothing is locally sourced and tailor-made. The vast majority of the population in Pakistan wear shalwar kameez, which goes through all of its phases of production locally, from natural fibers such as cotton being sourced from farms and being processed to create fabric, all within the country. Unstitched fabric is then sold to the masses, where each person gets their clothing custom stitched to their exact preferences. Whenever I travel to Pakistan, one of the main tasks is going to the clothing stores and buying unstitched fabrics. These fabrics are usually made with cotton, come in a variety of colors and patterns. In the summer, we wear lawn, which is a plain weave, high thread count cotton fabric, while in the winter, we wear khadar, which is a warmer blend of cotton and wool. Just a few months ago, I was there in Pakistan, participating in this whole affair. My mom, aunt, sister, and I went and bought all our fabrics and took them over to my aunt's neighborhood tailor, whose workshop is just a short walk away from her house. We gave him our fabrics and our measurements, and also pictures of our shalwar kameez fashion inspo. He gave us our quotation, and in just a week, we had our clothing custom-made to our exact preferences. Extending this approach to other societies require people, as a whole, to shift their mentality towards more farm-to-table fashion, as opposed to the globalized paradigm that's currently adopted. One of the accelerators of the globalization of the fashion industry is that clothing trends have become similar worldwide. Social media, with all of its positive and negative effects, has created a monolith of fashion, especially in the younger generation. So wherever you are in the world, you can identify similar patterns or pieces on people. This globalization has strayed people from going to their local clothing stores, and rather opting to order online from retailers who deliver worldwide. This is not necessarily a positive thing, though, as it forces local and traditional fashion to be pushed out of the limelight in their own countries or be appropriated into designs that would be more palatable to a global audience. Where do we go from here? Mass production fashion brands must own the responsibility of making fashion circular. They must educate the general public about what they can do with their piece once they're done using it. An example of a scheme that could be implemented is buying back used items for a small price, and then reusing that fabric in future manufacturing, and hence greatly reducing the negative environmental impact of the outfit as compared to if it had simply been thrown out. Now, I could describe to you a multitude of ways how we can make our fashion industry more sustainable by responsibly disposing of our items. I could start by talking about donation and recycling, and then go on to recommend composting and using natural dyes. But there are countless counter-arguments to how these are not real solutions to a global problem. Composting isn't accessible to most in the age of skyscrapers and apartments, and natural dyes are non-permanent and lack vividness. Even most donated clothing never actually ends up making it to recycling or thrift stores. Although thrift stores have achieved recent popularity, going from a place that was generally considered a last resort option to now becoming more and more mainstream. And as a whole, this is a really big win for the sustainability and fashion movement, as used clothing is no longer considered taboo by those who can afford to buy new. Still, more and more reports showcase that even thrift stores are now filling up with barely used throwaways from fast fashion brands. All this is not to say that these are not valuable actions and initiatives, because they are. But they still don't address the root of the issue. The solution to such a nuanced problem can't just be aimed at the latter end of the life cycle of clothing. We can't keep ignoring the poisoned rivers in Bangladesh and Indonesia to the old clothing littering the shores of East Africa, to the microplastics that are present in our very food and drinking water today. You may have noticed a lot of what I've been talking about is solely focused on the getting rid of our clothing aspect. In fact, most of the discourse around sustainability in fashion takes place in this: how do we reduce the amount in landfills, and what do we do at the end of our clothing life cycle space? We don't really talk much about why we're manufacturing such extreme amounts in the first place. For an industry that is defined by its progressiveness, fashion is cited by many sources to be the second largest polluter in the world, second only to oil and gas. Yes, oil and gas. In just the last 3 years, from 2019 to 2022, this industry has grown by 103%, selling 150 billion garments every year, 85% of which will inevitably end up in landfills, by the way. We should be asking the question of why are we producing at this scale? Do we really need so much? Do we really need to outwardly express ourselves with our clothing so exhaustively? And more importantly, how did we come to this point where the status quo is accepted as so unquestionably normal? The culprit is hyper-individualism. Overconsumption stems from hyper-individualism. The inflated sense of individuality forces people, especially those coming from non-collectivist societies, to feel unfulfilled if their exact identity isn't differentiated from the crowd, so that they don't feel like just another person part of the crowd. Countries with more individualistic societies have been studied to have a greater negative environmental impact than their collectivist counterparts. Hyper-individuality allows people to not care about the greater good, as it would only hinder their self-service. Unsurprisingly, the same individualistic nations are the greatest consumers of the fashion industry. But even more interestingly, they're seemingly spending the most on sustainability development. But that's a conversation for another day. So, how do we make a dent in this industry? With everything that we now know, is there really any hope for true sustainability in fashion? Or is it all just a joke to frame the narrative in a new light where the punchline remains the same? Our planet's suffering, and the people working under the hood of this industry getting worked to the bone, all whilst destroying their bloodline's future with toxic waste leaching into their water sources and old clothing littering their streets. All for the expression of hyper-individualism by those who choose to overconsume. And as a result of their actions, feed the industry that provides them with their drug of choice. It's recursive, with seemingly no escape route. At present, our rate of consumption is exponentially higher than the rate at which our planet can biodegrade the materials that we consume. Most of the negative environmental impact is out of our hands as just the end consumer. That is in the control of the companies that manufacture and the lawmakers that legislate environmental laws. But what we can do is be mindful of our consumption and educate ourselves around the topic of the global supply chain so that we're aware of the environmental footprint of each item that we purchase. We must become frugal in our consumption to reduce the overproduction pandemic. Relearn the art of mending our clothes rather than just throwing them away. And opt for natural and high-quality materials whenever we can, and try to prolong their lives as much as possible. But most importantly, we need to look inwards to gauge how important it really is to us to buy that dress in that specific color, or that top with that exact design. We need to analyze if we really need or want those things, or have we just been influenced to want to buy them? Until this shift occurs, brands that do mass produce need to stop greenwashing and be as transparent as possible so that the responsibility of sustainability is shared. Knowing how each outfit is negatively impacting the world in the long run will make people think twice about what and how much they're buying, and what will happen once they're ready to throw it. Lastly, if there's one thing I'd like to leave with you all today, is the message that the most sustainable clothing is the one that's in your closet already. Thank you.